Klaus, thank you for agreeing to meet with me today and also for inviting us to your offices in Geneva. Today, we want to talk about the state of the world and about your latest book on stakeholder capitalism. But we also want to talk a little bit about the forum, maybe to start this conversation. You founded the World Economic Forum in 1971 under the name European Management Forum at the time. You were also, back then, a professor at the Centre d'études industrielles, the CEI, which then became IMI, which then became IMD. What led you to create the European Management Forum?
Actually, as a teacher for the general management course, I had to reflect on what is actually the purpose of an enterprise. And I also was charged to write a book on modern management. So there was quite some discussion at that time because Milton Friedman had published his first articles. And I felt, no, that's not the right way to go. An enterprise is not just an economic unit, it's a social organism. So I captured and conceptualized this notion of stakeholder capitalism. But what was important, and I have to say, I feel you referred to the origin of my own teaching. I feel as a alumni to a certain extent of IMD. And I'm very proud of how IMD, after the merger of my school at that time and IMD has developed, I feel very proud, I would nearly say as a proud father of, let's say, the united institutions.
That's very kind of you. So you say, back then I already felt that there would a potential disconnect between what you now call stakeholder capitalism and shareholder capitalism, but that could have led you to write a book, and I know you did, and to do other things. Why did this lead to this European Management Forum?
I wanted to create a platform where stakeholders could meet, where business leaders could meet, environmentalists. For example, we were the first organization in the 70s which gave a voice to the Club of Rome, where they could meet politicians, where they could meet trade unionists on a European basis. And it was only later in the 80s when it expanded into a global dimension.
So you already had this intuition that the solution to complex issues would come from people from different backgrounds and different perspectives working together, and you wanted to give them a place, a safe place where they could work together and talk together.
Yes, and I think it was also influenced by the fact that I still experienced the end of the war. And I was very active, for example, in the German youth movement. And the whole idea during the end of the 40s and the 50s was no conflict, cooperation. So cooperation became for me, I would say throughout my life, the key word.
Now, over the last 5 decades, the forum obviously has developed enormously, as you said, at some point became global. That success was not preordained. And of course, anybody who knows the history of the forum knows that big part of its success is due to your own vision, drive, and leadership. In addition to your own vision, drive, and leadership, what would be 2 or 3 other reasons that explain the remarkable development of the World Economic Forum?
I think it's persistency. It's sticking to your values, and it's believing into a mission. I just give an example. One of the, let's say, biggest challenges I had in my life was when in the 70s, I invited a bishop from Brazil. I had visited Brazil, I went to Recife, I met the bishop, Don Elder Camara, and I saw for the first time in my life what poverty means in Recife. So I invited the bishop. He was called the Bishop of the Poor to Davos. And it created a lot of reactions. Companies at the time, not yet as sophisticated as today, wanted to boycott the meeting. There was very bad media coverage because he was considered a communist. But I felt I have to stick to my values. And we lost some participants, but we survived. And for me, it was a crucial moment in my life, which taught me at the end, you have to stick to your values.
And the principle was, if you want to find solution to complex problems, you have to hear every voice, and particularly the voice of the disenfranchised.
Today, more than ever before. And not only here, the voice of, let's say, all the stakeholders, but integrate, if possible, the voice of the stakeholders, because then you create co-ownership. And once you have reached a decision, you have the support of everybody. And I think it, in the first years of the existence of the forum, I was active in the board of a number of German companies where you had this notion of codetermination. And I think that influenced me also substantially. I noticed that sometimes it takes longer to take a decision, but once you implement the decision, you have the support of everybody.
Right. So longer at first, but then faster.
Or resistance at first, but afterwards, let's say, support.
Now, over the last decade, one of the big changes, I think, in the forum, and maybe it's 15 years, but over the relatively recent past, is you're hiring a significant number of thought leaders and content experts. And I think the reasoning was, as I remember it, that you wanted not only to be a place where you convened and gathered key decision makers for productive discussions, but you also wanted the forum to be able to guide and shape some of these discussions. So tell us about the evolution of the forum's mission in this respect, and more generally, your strategy for the forum.
No, you are right. First, we developed our convening power, and we became the organization which could convene top people from around the world. But convening is not enough. We felt we should add a knowledge dimension. So we developed our own intellectual capabilities. Now the next one was action. People want, if they give you their time, if they engage, they want to see an outcome. So we moved from, I would say, organizing interaction. We moved to catalyzing, from organizing interaction to catalyzing action. That's the motto which we had in mind. And that's the reason why we have today about 70 different initiatives bringing together stakeholders to work together to create solutions for complex problems.
Your latest book is entitled Stakeholder Capitalism, a global economy that works for progress, people, and planet. Now, in it, one of the things that you review is the evidence supporting the positive impact for progress, people, and planet of the global economy over the last few decades. And there's no doubt that there has been a positive impact on many fronts. There is also no doubt that this global economy, as we have practiced it over the last few years, is no longer fully sustainable. So first, can you review for us what has worked and what is no longer working?
No, I think we are at a watershed. We are finally moving into the age of stakeholder capitalism. It's not just a question of social responsibility and environmental responsibility. I mean, looking for your people and caring for the planet, I think it's in the self-interest of companies. Because if we look at the situation today, particularly in high-tech companies, but in all companies, I think in this watershed, also the mentality of clients, collaborators, and even investors is changing. Which means if you practice stakeholder capitalism, you also enhance, at least long-term, your profitability, because you get better employees, more motivated employees, particularly the young generation. And today, the most competitive, let's say, the factor most important for competitiveness is to have access to talents. Your clients will not necessarily buy products of a company they know of distracting the environment. And today, with impact financing, you may have even more favorable terms in your financing system. So I think it's for a sophisticated company, forward-looking company, it's, I would say, a must to move from a shareholder prioritization to an integrated concept of stakeholder capitalism.
These groups that you just mentioned, including employees, customers, you call them, I think, substitute regulators, or did I get the right term? Substitute regulators.
Yeah.
And of course, alongside these substitute regulators, you would expect there to be the regulators, meaning modifying the regulatory framework in a way that makes it more possible for organizations to do well by doing good. Right now, we're still asking in a number of areas companies to invest ahead of the curve, meaning that we believe that the substitute regulators will intervene, and increasingly they are intervening. But there's also a limit to how much more customers will pay. And the governments haven't yet fully engaged. What do you think is holding the governments back? Why are governments finding it so difficult to change the regulatory conditions, for example, to make it more financially possible for companies to invest in technologies that are more carbon friendly?
Because governments do not understand always the issue. I mean, again, the technology is moving very fast. And we speak usually even of technologies in development in a time horizon of 2, 3, 4 years coming up. Governments also, I'm personally for self-regulation. I give you an example. It would be very difficult for governments today to force companies, because in many domains, particularly if we talk, for example, about regeneration of nature and so on, we do not have the measurement systems. So companies have to take the lead. I give you one example which we just experienced. Maersk, the shipping company, ordering 8 cargo ships, paying a premium of 15%. I think the ship costs $175 million. The ships will be delivered only in the coming years, but the ships, and that's the innovation, will be driven by carbon neutral fuel.
Right.
So by green fuel. So the technology, to a certain extent, still has to be developed to create the necessary, to to drive a ship is quite a complex issue. So the technology is not completely ripe, but by doing this order, I think the shipyard is encouraged to go ahead with this green technology. We need much more of those examples where we allow, and it was also described, it's not my idea, I think Bill Gates describes it also in his latest books. We need to bundle, for example, the purchasing power to make sure that we develop the technologies which we still need to reach the objective of being carbon neutral in 2050.
But governments could increase the speed of this transition, right? For example, if governments got together and say, we're going to set a relatively high carbon tax and we're going to use some of the proceeds to allocate money to support some government so that they support some, again, nature-related activities.
You hit exactly the point. In my opinion, governments, for example, should price the external costs, should internalize them, and then we could use, let's say, the CO2 price collections to support certain innovations.
Why isn't that happening yet?
I think governments and to a certain extent also business, we have been, and I come back to the speed of change, we have become so focused on the short term that we try to fix short-term problems and we are completely absorbed. Look at the energy which went into mastering now the COVID with all its implications on business. So we lose our capability really to address long-term challenges and to find the right patterns which are needed to have a response to the long-term challenges.
Interesting. So in your view, this is in part a case of the urgent driving out the important.
Yeah, and it's for business, but it's even more for governments.
Okay. Interesting. Now, you mentioned earlier investors and the financial world moving. And clearly a number of very influential actors in that world have spoken up. And in some cases, there is a perception, at least among some individuals, that the words go significantly further than the deeds. How much do you really see the financial world moving to investing in organizations that are more conducive to a sustainable and inclusive world? Is this really, really changing?
The problem for the financial world until now was the lack of ESG measurement systems. I mean, there's a panoply. There are so many systems around.
Yes.
So if you have different systems, you cannot compare and you cannot really measure. So what the forum did in cooperation with its International Business Council, led by the CEO of Bank of America, we brought the 4 key audit companies in the world together. And we said, let's elaborate a ESG system where we have metrics, where companies around the world could be measured. We have developed this system. Over 50 companies, big companies with millions of employees, have used it for the first time, even in their annual reports. The forum, we did it also. In our next annual report, we'll have ESG measurements, ESG metrics based on our system. And now we are in discussion with because we are not a standard setter, now we are in discussion with let's say, global standard setters, global rating agencies and so on, to make the system much more mainstream.
So you're confident that the measurements are improving at a sufficient pace?
Yeah, because you can really see who are the bad guys and who are the good guys. And if you see a tendency very often to address, let's say, climate change. It is a hugely complex task with many components. Just think also of the supply chain you have to take care of. So what is very often happening and what people call afterwards greenwashing is that you concentrate on one issue and you make a contribution, but a very unidimensional contribution. Now with such a sophisticated measurement system, you can see how much you are really contributing in a systemic way to solve the issue of whatever it is, particularly of climate change.
Is this one of the reasons why, as you put it in a number of your writings, for decades, the shareholder capitalism model won, right? I mean, in 1970, Friedman wrote his article. I think in 1971, you wrote a book on that topic.
Exactly.
And I guess for a number of years, Friedman's position was more dominant. Is one of the reasons for this dominance our inability precisely to measure externalities and to measure long-term costs of corporate decisions?
It took quite some time to develop the financial standards which allow us to compare companies related to profitability and so on. So we have now a similar process related to the ESGs, but I think there's another phenomenon why, let's say, we move into the shareholder, from the shareholder concept to the stakeholder concept. The shareholder philosophy was also driven, when I look the development in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was driven by, or the focus on shareholder value was driven by, let's say, a change in the composition of shareholders. Because I remember when I wrote my book, there was still this notion of social market economy, which means you have a market economy, but you have also your social responsibility. But at that time, the shareholders were, that's the difference, were very much oriented as family-owned companies and so on.
They were investing their own money.
And were oriented long-term. And then you had this change into much more short-term oriented shareholdership with hedge funds and so on. And now I think those hit a certain wall because, as I mentioned, there are new expectations from a new generation. There are new challenges. So I'm very confident that the victory will be declared in the long end for stakeholder capitalism.
One of the questions is, will this happen fast enough? Recently, I was in a discussion with a number of senior executives, and the question of climate change came up. And the tenor of the discussion was something like this. It was 1.5 degree, technologically possible, but would require a mobilization that the world is not capable of. 2 degrees, same thing. So really, we're looking at 3 degrees, which of course could trigger extremely problematic consequences for the world. My question is, are you confident that, again, stakeholder capitalism will win in the end? I get that, but will this shift come fast enough for the world to be able to avoid these very severe consequences, by the way, that we're starting to observe, or are we better off saying, look, this battle is partly lost, and so let's plan for a world which is going to be plus 3 degrees?
if someone would have this argument with me, I would tell him, yes, you may be a practitioner, you have a technical view, which is a pessimistic view, but now I ask you as a grandfather, if you are a grandfather today, as I am, where my grandchildren will still live with the present life expectancy at the transition to the next century, So do I really take the responsibility that they have to suffer all those consequences which we know of just because we don't take on our own responsibility? And we think only in economic terms and not in the necessary terms of responsibility to be stewards for the next generations also. It's again, if I may say so, it's again an expression of the shorter term thinking.
Well, I think you're adding one other notion, which is that of personal responsibility that each of us face.
Right? As a member of our societies.
Right. And clearly each of us has limited power individually, but if enough of us start pushing in one direction, it can make a difference. I'm still concerned that somehow we are hoping for things to move faster than they have. If I look realistically over the last few years, we had set targets for the world and we're nowhere near those targets. So there's going to be another meeting in Glasgow soon. And so I remember William of Orange, you don't need to succeed, you don't need to hope in order to try, and you don't need to succeed in order to persevere. Nevertheless, sometimes you look and you go, what will be needed? What is needed for the world to accelerate further on this transition?
I think change is not happening. Let's take it. Change is provoked or constructed by us. And let's take the IPCC report. Of course, you read about irreversible change, which we have already now. But you also read, you have still the possibility to come down probably somewhere between, if we are realistic, if we take all our efforts, we may limit at 1.5 to 2 degrees. So to avoid the most catastrophic scenario. I think the key is collaboration. And we have had another phenomenon in the world, mainly, driven by different, let's say, factors. Some people would say social media is one factor, that we have become much more egocentric. And cooperation in an egocentric world is much more difficult, of course. And in order to make progress, it requires cooperation. So I'm not so concerned about a lack of possibilities to act. I'm much more concerned about the lack of the will for cooperation. And it's on many levels. I mean, we see it on the global level, particularly the tension between the US and China, which but even here we can be optimistic. There is now a discussion between the US and China related to working together to address climate change. So I'm
cautiously optimistic, I guess.
Cautiously optimistic. Okay. But even on national levels, I mean, we have difficulties to create the necessary consensus. Right. That's, in my opinion, the biggest challenge which we face today is how to create consensus in an egocentric world.
One of the areas we're working on with a number of corporate partners is a little bit this direction, which is how can they create narratives, and of course narratives as in accurate and realistic narratives, explaining to their various stakeholders the need for delayed gratification. Because the reality is there cannot be progress without delayed gratification. And one of the problems many governments face is their inability to explain to their citizens the need to accept some pain now in order to avoid much more pain later.
We have maybe not anymore the capability exactly to absorb short-term sacrifices for the benefit of the long term and of the whole community. Because it's, if we say short-term sacrifices and long-term benefit, the problem is also the sacrifices are not equally distributed.
Yes.
And the benefit is not equally distributed. That's the problem.
Yes. Klaus, I'm a professor of leadership. I would like to finish with two questions that are more personal in nature, if I may. The first one is a little bit iconoclastic, and I hope you will forgive me for it. You have been leading the forum since its creation. You created it 50 years ago, and you are still leading it with enormous energy and drive. The reality is that time catches up with all of us at some point. And so I'm sure that you've had discussions with your board at some point about succession. So I'm sure that those discussions are occurring. I am curious, at your own level, how are you thinking about this? Again, you're still absolutely very much not only in charge, but also very much contributing new ideas and new directions. Are you thinking at some point about succession, or are you very much focused on your job? How are you experiencing this?
No, of course. When you build an organization for 50 years, you have the continuity very much in your mind. Now, as far as the forum is concerned, we have a very engaged board of trustees with the necessary subcommittees, and I have a very, let's say, relatively large managing board led by a president. So I could make my answer very easy in let's say, practical terms. There are enough good people in both boards to ensure the continuity. But I would like to add a more, let's say, to a certain extent, a new perspective. In the old age where experience counted a lot, you had to groom a successor. Mm-hmm. So you determined your successor quite early, and then you groomed him. Today, experience is less important. What is much more important is that you are in line with the times. I mean, you are forward-oriented, you are fast learner, and so on. So my argument is when the need for a successor, when we have the need for a successor, not necessarily for the forum, I think for any organization, you should find not necessarily someone inside, you should find the best person on the market or whom you can convince at such specific moment of time.
And what I'm hearing is that one of the key characteristics in this very fast changing world will be their ability to keep learning.
Yeah, and look what happened. If I look at our partner companies, in the past, you had someone coming to retirement age, let's say at 65, then nominating a successor who is probably 55. Today, what we see is jumping a generation. Right. Look at, let's say, Citibank, and I could enumerate a whole number of companies where now the successor is in the early 40s. And that's a new trend, which means you have to choose people who are more familiar with, let's say, the new context, and maybe not so much familiar anymore with the tradition of the company.
At a personal level, is there a temptation to try not to think about this?
No, if you are a responsible person, I mean, in the case of the forum, I discuss it regularly with my peers in the board. You have a responsibility, and at the moment, it doesn't preoccupy me. I'm in the fortunate situation that I told the board, look, I continue as long as I'm in full control of my physical and intellectual capabilities. If you feel I'm not anymore in control, you tell me and I go. If there is an event, accident or whatever, we have to be prepared, of course. But it's not something which is preoccupying me.
Now, last question. I'm not going to ask you what keeps you engaged and energized, because that's quite clear. You have a passion for the mission of the forum. You feel a sense of responsibility to the world and to future generations. You already explained this. Now, for some of us, the life that you lead, crisscrossing the world, especially in non-COVID times, but to be with key decision makers discussing difficult topics, this would be stressful. Organizing meetings in Davos for thousands of people, which raises all sorts of diplomatic and also basic security questions, would be stressful. How do you manage this stress? Do you feel the stress?
No, yes, of course. But I think every leader today has to cultivate his or her mental and physical resilience. I cultivate my mental resilience by focusing very much on what I'm interested in.
Okay.
You never would see me on a party if it's not family focused, or let's say going to any event. I try to be at home, to read, and not to have, except what I have to do for the forum, to have what you would call a social life. This helps me to be very focused mentally on what I'm doing.
Okay.
And of course, physically, I think I'm a very big believer that you do every day sports. For me, it's every day at after breakfast, a light breakfast, at 7:30 until 8:10, I'm swimming. Okay. And I'm swimming not leisurely. I have a jet, so I'm really afterwards, I relax for 10 minutes and read my papers and so on. But that's a tradition.
So strong rituals.
You need strong ritual, and you need some life principles. You cannot avoid to have negative surprises, and you have something, you're very upset about a person and so on. So my principle is never lose time with something which is negative. It isn't easy because we have feelings, we have also negative feelings. But once you make it as a principle and you control yourself, and whenever something preoccupies you in a negative way, then I say, no, my principle is concentrate on the positive side of life. It's much more efficient, but it's much more enjoyable also.
And when you say on the positive side, I guess this also means on the productive side. What can I do about it?
Such probably is a necessary conclusion afterwards.
So you never get discouraged and you never get deflated when you see less progress than you would like.
No, you of course you get, but and it's good that you have sometimes the stress, because then you are even more pushed to do something about it. But I think what is important, a doctor would tell you what is particularly dangerous if something develops into a chronic disease. So you cannot make negative sentiments chronicalized.
Okay. So some temporary stress, but not chronic.
Yeah.
Klaus, I thank you very much for your time and for your insights. It was a pleasure.
For me, it was a great pleasure.
Thank you so very much.